All right, Lily, kick us off.
Right.
Take us away.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're all here. Let's see. I am really excited to talk a little bit today about our journey with figuring out menus. All right. So we're going to get right into it here. So we had a few whys for why we wanted to start with menu or have a menu routine in our kindergarten classroom. The first was that we wanted to make sure that our students were having a lot of opportunity to experience gameplay, to develop their fluency and to develop their appreciation and just learn about themselves as mathematicians. And in this particular year, we had, sadly, we had kids coming to school on that very first day that so many of them had already decided they were not math people. So we knew we had to really be careful and craft math experiences and their math time in a way that felt inviting and engaging for our learners. So we were working on their math mindsets. And in this particular year that I'm going to talk about, I had 19 students. I had 17 boys and 2 girls. And we were pretty busy. And we just needed to be active as much as possible, moving around. So when we did our fall assessments, we got that information back, and we then looked at where we were at, and we sat down with the HLCs, and we started to design warm-ups in particular, and then menu choices that were going to give students lots of opportunity to engage with the high leverage concepts from All Learners Network. I just want to say that I'm going to share at the end a PDF with slides, and there are some links in those slides to a lot of the different things that I'm going to talk about. And then one thing we didn't have, but I wish we had, were the learning progressions for the HLCs. They were not out yet, but when I look at them today and I think about where we were at, it would have been so much more helpful to just dial in even a little bit closer into the details. So that's another really wonderful tool for thinking about and planning the different kinds of games or warm-ups that you might use with your kiddos. All right, so for the purposes of our time today, in terms of the All Learners lesson structure, there's always a launch, there's the concept development, there's the menu time, and there's the closure. And I'm really going to be focusing on the warm-up. And so in that particular case, it was really a transition routine that took on a whole new life of its own. And then our menu time down here. Okay, I just want to say that I made these slides this summer before I knew that Steve Lineman was going to join us today, but I love this quote, and it follows me everywhere I go. I share it with people all the time. It's really, really true that everything begins with counting. And I think it might be my teaching mantra. And we kept that in mind as we were thinking about how we could develop our students' ability to count, and also not just rote counting, not just counting objects, but really like taking a deep dive and moving to sort of that out of that surface learning of counting and into that deep conceptual learning of counting. All right, so when I say warm up, I am specifically talking about an independent transition routine that got our kids from recess. So we always came in from recess, and you know what it's like in kindergarten, right? You come in from recess and you've got 7 kids that are ready to go in 30 seconds, and you've got 7 kids that still have all their snow clothes on, right? Yeah, I see some nodding heads. Yeah. So and with this group in particular, we had really just sort of one end or the other. We had kids that were ready to go and kids that needed some time, and we also had some kids that really were content to stay in the cubby area with their coats and their boots on, because they didn't love math. So we needed a series of games and activities that had movement, that were engaging, and that were low floor, high ceiling, so that everybody could participate at their level and have some fun. We also wanted it to be something that they could do fairly independently, to the point where I could just put up a picture on the board. And then, because oftentimes it was just me and them, so I'm in there tying shoes, and and the kids are over at the rug, and I needed them to be engaged, and I wanted them to have fun. I wanted them to, yeah, have fun, enjoy themselves. So that was our goal for our warm up. So I was super bummed when I found out we were going to be virtual, because I wanted us to play these games together, but here we are. So the first game that that we play, and that we played all year long, and it changed and shifted and moved throughout the year, was roll and go. So it's really hard to see here, but there's a little number on the wall back there. And I would put, numbers up all around my room, depending upon what range of numbers we were working on, or working with rather. And initially with students, we just came into the roll and go with just numbers 1 through 6, and we're rolling those, just a regular old dot dice, and they would go to the number that they rolled. And then as we had all made our way into the rug area, then we would work on that stable order, and counting whatever the sequence of numbers was up around the room. Everyone would count that sequence. So there was a component of playful moving around the room, and then there was, again, making sure that we were always checking in with them about where they were at with, in this particular case, with the stable order of the count sequence. And then the roll and go changes throughout the year. Sometimes we would put different images up. The range of numbers expands. So in the beginning of the year, really just for like the first month, it was 1 to 6, because that was the dice we were working with. And then we moved on to other dice. We changed up the dice we were rolling and going with. And we would add different images depending upon what we were introducing for the students in terms of ways to model their thinking. And then sometimes we did some roll and go with lift a flap. I can't really lift a flap, but underneath there, I would have a number, and then we'd have an image underneath. And in this particular one, it was how many more to make 5. So that's what that particular roll and go was. I think for when we did this one too, we had another little number up here, which was the number that they rolled. So like if they rolled a 6, they would go there, and then we were working on combinations to 5 with that one. So we played around a lot with different ways to keep the activity the same, of rolling a dice and going to a number, and then we switched up what they could see or notice or do at each number. In the dead of winter, when we couldn't really be outside very much, or we couldn't be outside for as long as we were accustomed to, we would have little exercises or different things that they could do when they got to the number. Sometimes we'd have them get there, and we'd have them, we had a awesome naturalist that would come to our classroom, and so sometimes roll and go on that day would be something that was linking back to what that naturalist had done with us. So we was this wonderful independent routine that we could switch up and change up for the students. So some of the things that we would do with roll and go, sometimes I'd have them roll their dice and go to 1 more, or roll their dice and go to 1 less. When we were working with teen numbers, we would roll the dice and add 10, and then find that teen number. Like I said, sometimes it was do a certain number of jumping jacks, or they'd read the mystery number. And then sometimes, and this was a really big hit, I would ask them, or they would take 6 dice, and they would, excuse me, does anyone know the game Tenzi? Where you roll all the dice, yeah, and you're trying to get your dice to say all the same number. So we did it with 6Z, because we were working with just regular 1 to 6 dice, and so they would take 6 dice, and then they would roll the dice. And when they got all 1s, first they would start at 1, so they'd roll their dice and roll all 1s, and then they would go to 2, and then they'd roll all their dice to make 2, and so on. So that was another variation of roll and go that was very popular. I had to find more dice in the building because we didn't quite have enough dice at the time. And again, we were working on thinking about the stable order of the count sequence, also before, what comes before, what comes after, and then so many other things too as the year went on. You know, like I said, combinations to 5 and different things like that. All right, so that was roll and go, and the students, that was a great game because we could play that game any time of the day, and I would just say to them, hey, let's play roll and go. They would go get their dice and they would know exactly what to do. And it was particularly helpful too if we were waiting for something. And you know what it's like when you have 5 minutes on the clock, and or someone's 5 minutes late. That's a really long time in kindergarten. So it was a great independent activity that got kids moving, talking about numbers, noticing features of number, and experiencing the count. All right. So another warm up that they were also really great about being independent with is called Mix It Match It. And I would have a set of cards for Mix It Match It ready for that day. And sometimes I literally just wrote them down while they were out at recess, and they were just torn up pieces of paper. Sometimes they were a little more formal. You can see here I had numbers. They were working on decade transitions for this particular Mix It Match It. Sometimes we use tiny polka dot cards. Sometimes we just use regular playing cards. I would have the deck of cards ready to go, and the kids would come in. They would take one card off the top of the pile and they would mix it. So it's a little bit like I have Who Has, except that you're playing the whole time. And so they were looking for, we'll look here. So oftentimes in the beginning of the year, they were looking for things that were the same, or they were mixing around and they'd say, I have 3 or I have 8, and then they'd switch their cards and then they'd go to the next person. And they'd keep mixing. And as more kids came in, then there were more opportunities to mix. And then as we were all there at the circle or the rug, I would say, okay, match it. And they'd have to find somebody that had something the same. Sometimes it was exactly the same. So, and it looked the same. And other times it was the same, but different. More often than not, it was like this. And sometimes it was when we were working on those combinations to 5, sometimes I'd even have like them in groups of 3, and then I'd have them sit down and talk about, okay, what's the same about your cards and what's different about your cards, to get them talking to each other about it. So again, another really lovely, independent activity once we learned it and went through the steps of how we play. And we needed reminders from time to time that you have to mix it. You can't just kind of hang out on the edge and wait for your buddy to come along. And of course we would still do that sometimes, but most of the time we were able to mix it up. And what was great about it is that oftentimes we were sitting down ready for the next step in the math in our math lesson, and we had visibly random groupings for that day, or visibly random partners, which was also really nice. And they got really used to that. In the beginning, they really wanted to sit with their buddies, but then they really understood over time that, nope, I'm going to work with a different person every day. And so this was a really great game to encourage that. It didn't happen every day. So for kids that needed that assurance that they were going to get to work with their buddy, that happened as well. So, Mix It Match It. And then we use Mix It Match It in all times of the day, but sometimes we were matching numbers or matching number and quantity, shapes. Then that earlier picture, we were trying to find the decade and to the end of the decade, and then the transition to the next decade. You can do Mix It Match It with anything. All right. Let's see. Okay. So there are 4 warm-ups that we used, and they were always in rotation every week. So, and with this particular group, I really had to do the same thing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Friday was a grab bag. The special helper of the day would pull the sign out of the grab bag, and that's what we would do. So if I didn't have a Mix It Match It ready to go, that's sometimes what I was doing during recess. And then they needed to know that what was happening each, they needed that consistency to feel comfortable, this particular group. So the third day of the week was always scoop, sort, and count. Or sometimes, if you've ever done classes with Lori Silvis or Sandy Stanhope, they call it handfuls. But I had different size scoops, and they could take a scoop of an item, and then they would first figure out what they had, sort it, count it. So we were really working on cardinality. This group did not have cardinality beyond really 5 or 6 when they came in. And so we needed a lot of object counting. And then when they were done, they put it back and they could take another scoop. Again, we set up the routine to make it independent. We taught them, where your scoop should land and what the routine was for the items. Didn't always go smoothly, but for the most part, they were able to scoop, sort, and count. We had lots of different things that they could scoop, sort, and count and notice the features of. The Scrabble tiles were a huge hit. And I often had to give them a little extra time because, they wanted to find the first letter in their name or the first letter in a sibling's name. And then later on, actually, we started paying attention to the numbers and they were starting to sort the different kinds of numbers. Like, I have all these letters have 2s and all these letters have other numbers on them. So, and why is the Q 10? So it was that noticing of features. Same thing with the buttons. So that's scoop, sort, and count. And they had one more routine that we did in rotation, which came in a little bit later on in the year, but I would say probably about, I think it was in December when we started, which is what's in the cup, where we're really we're putting all of our thinking around counting, around number together and thinking about what's in the cup. And in the very beginning, we had just one dice, and I think it might even have been a teacher-made dice that was 1 to 3, and the kids would shake the cup, and we always had, so there was someone who was going to start the what's in the cup. So it was whoever was first to the rug, and usually didn't seem to be that big of an issue, but it was an issue at one point. So then we just kind of had a what's in the cup list of who was going to start, which was also motivating to get out of the cubbies. So they would put their dice in the cup, they'd shake it up. And the first iteration of it was to just clap the quantity. And then the other kids had to show them their math hands of how many it was, and we were obviously working on, taking turns, making sure everybody's voice was heard. Later on, what's in the cup became 2 dice in the cup. So then we were working on part whole. So the kids in that case, they would say how many were in the cup. And so if it was 6, then kids would say, is it 3 and 3? Is it 4 and 2? Sometimes, especially with these dice, we'd have a little debate about whether it could be 7 and 1 or whether it could be 6 and 0, but we'd still honor those contributions. And we did a few different things with what's in the cup. We did part whole, where we had red and yellow counters, and I had a bigger cup, it was a yogurt container. So they always knew what the total was. And so the person whose job it was to say what was in the cup would say how many red counters there were. And so then they'd have to figure out how many yellow counters. So then they were working on part whole that way. And we were looking at different ways to make the same number. And I think, let's see, oops. Yeah, and then the other thing that they asked, that's the other thing. A lot of the differentiation in the different warm-ups came from the students. They were really curious about, or they were really interested in thinking about how they could add to ideas. And one of the students asked if we could use the place value dice in what's in the cup. And so they would roll the place value dice. So they had the 10s and the 1s, and then they would write how many 10s and how many 1s. And then the other kids, this was way later in the year. This was like June, May, June. They would have to figure out what the number was, or they'd build it on arrow cards. So that was another, and that came from them. That didn't come from me, which was kind of fun. All right. So those were our warm-ups. That got us into menu. And like I said at the beginning, we were really working with our kids' mindsets, we really wanted to develop independence. Or actually, they were pretty independent with this particular group. We needed to sort of we needed to hone in their independence a little bit and direct it towards what we wanted them to work on. And then also agency. So being able to make their own choice, make a good choice for themselves, and even maybe make a choice and realize it wasn't a good fit and then make a new choice. So do some reflection on that. That was really hard for a lot of kiddos, but we gave them the space to you know, ask the question, does this feel like a good game? Does this feel like a good choice to me? Did I pick a dice that works for my brain? And so sometimes we would use the Goldilocks example, and I would say, did you Goldilocks it? Does it feel just right? Are the numbers exactly where you want to be? Are they too big? Are they too small? And I really trusted them, because even when something looked like it was too hard in my mind, oftentimes it was hard, but because they had chosen it, they dug in and they really made sense of whatever it was that they were working with on their own, even though it was a range of numbers that maybe they didn't have a lot of practice with. It didn't matter, because they had made the choice and they were able to make sense for the most part for what they're doing. So we started out the year really, really simple with, that's weird. Oh, I know why, sorry. With really simple as sort of digital menu that we projected up on the board. And then we lost our classroom. And we had to move, and we didn't have a digital board anymore. We didn't even have a classroom for a while. We were just in the gym. That was bananas. So we had a paper, like a paper menu that they did surprisingly well with, but I would say that of our menu systems, this was my least favorite, mostly because it was just one more material management thing for them. But some kids work great with it, and it was March, so they were a little more skillful with materials management at this point. But again, this was my least favorite. And then when we did finally have a space, we sort of tried to recreate our virtual version with menu cards. So we always tried to make sure in our menus that we had an opportunity to practice number writing, an opportunity to practice object counting and or row counting, but most of the time it was object counting, and then working on the sequence or stable order. So there was always a game or an activity that allowed them to make sense of these components. And counting jars were always a choice. Even if they got forgotten in the menu, they were always a choice. And if the counting jars were not in a choice, believe me, I was corrected. So they were a really big hit. And it was fascinating to watch students evolve with the counting jars and what they would make sense of, how they would organize their count, and then how they would later on represent their counts. We'll talk a little bit more about counting jars in a few minutes here. So like I said, in the beginning of the year, we had a really simple virtual menu where I really wanted them to, it was really kind of just a choice board. They could make a choice, and we wanted them to go to that choice, go to that place. So for each choice up here, there was a place in the room where those menu options existed, or it was a basket that was on the table. And we really wanted them to be able to make a choice, stick with the choice, clean up the choice, and then if there was time, make a second choice. Oftentimes there wasn't quite time, but sometimes there was, depending upon what they chose to do. So it's actually, this is day 13, I can see there. So this was really early on in the year. And it was always pretty much wide open that if you wanted to do something, you could. But this was early on with number writing, and I had just one table of number writing because I wanted to keep a hawk eye on what was happening at the table with the number writing. I wanted to make sure we were attending to the directionality, especially the numbers that we had already practiced. Later on, the number writing games don't have a limitation, but in the beginning of the year, I did have a limitation, like I said, for making sure. I had help in my room for half of math time. So not at the beginning, but at the end. And so then there was always another adult that was sort of keeping an eye on counting jars, mostly just to help open the jars. And to be there also to, actually the two things, open the jars and then parallel count through those teen numbers for students that needed that support in the beginning of the year. So we started the year out with this virtual menu. This was actually our very first menu. It just had 4 choices. Like I said, we were keeping it really, really simple. But I knew that I wanted to get to a point where we were building in some of the things that I learned through All Learners. I wanted to make sure there was a fluency routine. I wanted to make sure that there was maybe some problem solvers or some puzzles in there. So I had some ideas of where I wanted to get to, and I knew this wasn't our final destination. This was just the start to get them used to the routine. Okay. So one of the ways that we got them sort of curious about what was coming next, because if you remember, this is a group that was not psyched about math, was I would leave these blank boxes on the menu the day before just to pique their curiosity. What, something new is coming. And so that was very appealing. And in fact, I kind of forgot to do it later on, especially when we lost our classroom and we didn't have the virtual board anymore. And I was reminded that that we didn't have, Miss Lilly, you don't have coming attractions anymore. We talked about what coming attractions were at the movie theater, like when you go to the movies and the movie that isn't out yet played, it was kind of like that. And so I had to resurrect the coming attractions. This group was very good at reminding me about when I stuck with the routine and when I strayed from the routine. And when I strayed from the routine, that's when things got a little tricky or there were issues. And the other time that there were any sort of like behavior issues or just sort of what we called the math funks, usually was a pretty good indication that we needed new material in our menu. Menu choices were pretty much for the week. Although, like I said, some things were always on the menu. Some things were on the menu all the time, but they changed every week. And then the other thing that I tried to do a lot was incorporate pictures of them into the menu, doing the games and activities that were available to them. Not just because kindergartners love to see themselves, although they do, but also just to see them doing math and smiling and having fun. And this is not a staged photo. They were actually having fun, which sometimes I had to remind them. But so they are playing all in a row there. And then of course, those pictures ended up in the menu. Let's see. Sometimes I played around with the size of things in the menu to indicate that it was available for more people. That seemed like that made a lot of sense to my adult brain. It was meaningless to them. They were like, there's always plenty of room for everybody. You always bring another chair over. So that was something that I thought would be really clear, and it didn't have any meaning for them, for this particular group. Maybe another group it might have. I played around with, doing like integrating the small group work into our menu time. That sort of worked, but it meant I didn't have as many menu choices. And this had more to do with not having a lot of extra adult help in the room. But it was helpful in the sense that they got to, it was an organizational piece for me that was really helpful. They could see their name, they knew where they were starting, or they knew that if they weren't starting up here in in the small group with me or going to Dreambox, then they were going to be able to make a choice. This wasn't my favorite, but it worked. But it felt a little bit like menu. I wanted to really honor the fact that just like when you go to a restaurant, the menu, well, I mean, I guess if you're paying, but the menu is totally open to you. And I felt like this got a little bit away from that. And so then I tried doing some other things. Like I wanted them to all start with a counting jar this particular week. And so I put the star out and it sort of worked, but I had a lot of negotiating about, well, do I have to start there? And so what I realized I needed a first and a then. And so this was really early on, and I specifically had really limited choices because I wanted to practice the first do this, then do this. And then and that really only took, I don't know, I think maybe just that first week. I mean, I tried to remember what my cooperating teacher told me many years ago. Like, if you're going to change the routine, do it for 2 weeks. It's going to go like this, and then it will get smooth. But this was a change that went pretty smoothly. And then eventually I was able to have it so that if it's a yellow box, then you get to choose one of those. It's your choice, any of the yellow boxes, and then you can go to a menu choice down here, or you can do another one of these yellow boxes. So I was trying to get back to that place of like, here's something I want you to try first. And I was always really explicit with them. Hey, we're practicing number writing this week. We hadn't quite gotten into the point of like putting up our objectives yet. And also sometimes I often wrote up our learning targets. You know, these were kindergartners, and so most of them weren't really reading at this point, if at all, throughout the school year. And so the learning target was really more to keep me on track. But we didn't have that just yet. But then later on, I was able to put the learning target in. We're practicing writing numbers. Here are your 3 choices. And so I was starting to get to that place where I wanted to build in the fluency first, or a fluency specific, excuse me, a specific fluency practice, and then you could make a choice from any of these choices. And I forgot to put the line in one day, and they reminded me. And so the line came back the next day, and I spaced it, and I made them green, and I heard about it. So I had to go back and make those have tos, or do this first yellow, then the line, and then from there, all choices were available. So your kindergartners are definitely going to let you know if you goofed up a routine or if you weren't consistent. And I have to say that one of the things that we learned was being so super consistent was so important. It made our jobs easier later on because they knew exactly what we expected from them. And if they didn't, or if they weren't quite sure, we could go back to the structure of the menu, back to the structure of the first one of these, and then down here, and we could remind them, and it was comforting for them. One thing that we started to work on and we started to include in the beginning of our menu routine were window panes. And we started these in early February. We went on February break. We came back. We were going like gangbusters. March 13th came, and y'all know what happened in 2020. And that was the end of our window panes. And I was so bummed because we were really getting into a routine of doing one of our window panes each time before we went to a menu choice. And so again, it was a little bit more opportunity to practice not in this case, it wasn't necessarily specific to the high leverage concepts. It was more specific to our curriculum goals, but it gave them another opportunity, gave me a chance to do some formative assessment, which is really what I use these for. Were kids able to engage with the content in the window panes independently? Unfortunately, it was not a routine that we got to really sort of see through to the end, but and I'm not in the classroom right now, but I am working with some kindergarten teachers, and we are bringing back those window panes. And so I'm excited to see by the end of the year what that looks like and how that routine works out, and you know, how it informs our formative assessment as we go. So then, like I said, we lost our classroom. So weird, but we lost our classroom. So we were sort of like in 3 different places throughout the day. So I tried to recreate our virtual menu with the paper menu, and you can see I've got my learning targets up there. And it did not go well. The kids couldn't see. With their paper menu, they were actually really good with their paper menus, but they would lose them. Like, I'd find them underneath the bookshelf and be like, I don't know where my menu is. I don't know either. And it just felt frustrating. And we were getting to this place, we'd gotten to this place of like, yay, math, to like, this is a frustrating thing. And I had like such a tiny little like range of emotional stamina when it came to that. I had to keep, you know, I mean, let me just tell you, at Halloween, I had to fill the jars with all these Halloweeny things, and it got us over a hump. And so these guys, and the two girls, they just had a really low or a really high disappointment ratio, I guess. And so we tried this for a couple weeks. It was an epic fail, but I have used this system with older students, with first graders and second graders, and it did work. And so I tried to think, like, how can I recreate that format that they were accustomed to? And so I recreated all the menu cards. I just slapped a magnet on the back of them, and I was able to put them back up on the board. But we had to back up, because in the frustration of the move and the craziness of being in a different space, we kind of regressed a little bit in our menu independence and our ability to make a good choice, our ability to work collaboratively with our peers without freaking out. And so we had to back up a little bit. So we backed up and to just total free choice menu. And I had their name cards, so they could put their little name card underneath, is what we decided. And then I was able to go back and then again start with the first this, then these, or this. That the first this choice was always a choice. And then be more complex about it. So you can see this a little bit later in the year. We're working on combinations to 5 there. And you'll notice there's no counting jars here. There's no counting jars here, but they were always a choice, and we popped them right in there. Okay, how are we doing on time? Oh, yay, okay. All right, so the other thing that we thought a lot about when we were designing our menus was having games that would last all year, that we could teach them in the beginning of the year, teach them the structure of the game, how you play, how you could play collaboratively, how you could play opposing each other, how you win gracefully, and all those key important kindergarten social emotional learning components. And then we just wanted those games to sophisticate over time, but we wanted the structure of the game to stay largely the same. So there were a few games that that I'm going to share with you now that we played from September 2nd all the way through. They got us even through the end in June. So even through our virtual learning, they were part of our virtual menus. And because the kids knew them so well, all I had to do was make a quick video for the students. They taught their parents how to play the games when we were all stuck at home in 2020. And it made that piece of virtual or remote learning a little bit easier. So let's see. So a couple things that we would do to extend the life of a game was change up the dice. Sometimes I would have to, it would start with me making my own dice for an activity, and then we'd use sort of traditional dice. Sometimes we'd play around with 1 to 6 with the numerals versus the dots, depending upon what we were paying attention to. Most of the time we worked with these dice, but every now and then we played a game with these dice, or they were choice. So that was the other thing, is that we'd have the game, students could choose which dice they wanted to work with. And I remembered talking with one of my VMI professors about the idea of practicing something that in theory is too simple, but that's actually a good thing, to go back and do things we've done before. And I sort of thought about it in the same way that, a ballerina steps up to the bar and she does those bar warm-ups, or they do those bar warm-ups every single time. I thought about it the same way, that it's practice and it's refining something we already know. And when I kind of let go of like, oh, you should be using these dice or something a little bit harder, and I just listened and watched and asked them questions, even in the context of using something that maybe would be perceived as too simple, they were taking it to a deeper place, because they understood those numbers, and they had a really good grasp on those numbers, and they could play around with them in a way that maybe they couldn't if the range was a little bit broader. If you can find dice that have a 0 on them, I would often have dice that were 1 to or 0 to 5. These were in like a random game I found I had in my classroom. The game has since disintegrated, but the dice last, because the other reason I wanted to have the reason I wanted to have 0 to 5 dice is I really wanted them to engage with the identity principle. Most of our dice, for at least the numbers one, they didn't have zeros on them. So they weren't really getting a chance to play around with 0 or none of something. And so sometimes I would have them start with these dice and then they could choose a different dice. But I noticed when I incorporated these dice into the collection, different kinds of noticing started to happen. So if you can have dice, you can also just, if you've got 1 to 6 dice, you can just put a piece of tape on the 6 and make it a 0. And it just sort of changed our conversation about the numbers we were working with, and we noticed different things that we wouldn't have noticed if there wasn't a 0. There's the 10-sided dice, there's 12-sided dice. There's so many different kinds of dice that you can play the same game with and just change up the dice. So I have these are the dice in dice. I don't know. I think I need reading glasses. These do not work for me, but the kids love them. And I'd be like, okay, if you say it's 4, I'll take your word for it. So we would use those dice in different versions of roll and record, different versions of roll, write, find, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. It's my new favorite number writing game, or before and after. So, or really any game that involves dice, we could switch up the dice and change the game for the students. All right, let's see. And then the other thing that we would do is play around with the cards. So sometimes a game required dice, sometimes it required cards, sometimes we could flip it up and we would play a roll and record, but we would flip and record. And what we were just trying to do was give them lots of different ways to see the same thing, but in different formats. And always making sure that as much as possible, maybe not so much with these 2 choices over here, but with all of these choices, that there was a way for them to double check what they thought they knew. So, they could count, they could use the 10 frame, and then that way they had a resource there to help them figure out what was going on. So could play around with the cards. So 2 games that we played all year, all in a row, and shut the box. I'm going to share with you all of these games at the end with the directions. So, but all in a row is exactly what it sounds like. The kids are taking cards and they're putting them in order. They're working on that sequence. We played it with all of these different cards. Not so much these cards, but we played a different sort of version of the game with those cards. This one I would just, this one I did with only a handful of kids, where we would take a stack of or a chunk of the cards, and we would maybe only like 6 or 7 of the cards we'd count out, and then we'd put those cards in sequential order. That was really hard, right? Because it's not all the numbers, and not everybody was able to access that version of the game. But that was one thing we did with those cards. The other thing we would use these cards for was just a flip and record. Flip the card and write the number. So kids that were working playing roll and record, there were also students playing flip and record, and they got to work with different kinds of numbers. And then shut the box, such a great game. You put the cards in order from 1 to 9, and you roll 2 dice, and you're trying to flip over. So you roll the dice. Let's say you get 7, and you have a 5 and a 2. You can flip over the 5. You can flip over the 2. You can flip over the 7. You can flip over any way to make the number 7. This game, we left it as is. We taught this game in, I think, December, and it was just on the menu pretty much for the rest of the year. Sometimes it wasn't on the menu and it was requested, so I would just make it a special of the day. And that was kind of actually the nice thing later on in the year, and we didn't have our classroom and we just had the magnetic cards. If there was something that wasn't on the menu and there was a real urgency to play that game, I could quickly pick it out and put it up and call it the special of the day. And we didn't really alter this game at all, except for the cards. So we'd kind of play around with the different cards that we used. Most of the time they chose to play with 10 frame cards. Sometimes they would play with these tiny polka dot cards. They'd pick a set. This set here was particularly challenging. Or they'd play with the savvy subitizing cards. So, but most of the time they played with the 10 frame cards. And that game just has a long shelf life on its own without a lot of changing up. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about a couple games here that we played that they loved, that also were really, anyone could access the game at any point or any level. So this was how we introduced this before and after game. The children would roll a dice or they'd flip a card. This was another place where we would use these bigger numbers later on in the year. They would write the number in the blue box, and then they would write what came before and what came after. So we were working on before and after. We were working on counting backwards. Then when it came time, so we played that a lot before we let them play the game independently. And when it came time for an independent choice, we had different versions of this board. Wherever the gray box was, that's where you put the number in that you rolled. And so sometimes there was a lot of counting backwards. Sometimes there was a lot of counting forwards, and sometimes there was a little mix. And it was a version of a roll and record and a number writing practice that didn't feel quite like this game. And they, the other thing was sometimes they'd roll a number and they had some choice. Sometimes I'd give them 2 dice and I'd say, pick one. So, because roll and record doesn't really have a whole lot of, there's no strategy to it, which is another piece that we would try to incorporate into our games, was some strategy. Some kids loved it, and so it was always available. But other students needed number writing practice that wasn't quite so mundane. So that was one way we sort of got around the whole roller and chord component. And then this is my new favorite game. So we'd give them, sometimes we'd give them a grid, or sometimes we'd just have them make a little grid on a whiteboard. They got pretty good at that. And then we'd have them roll their dice and write the numbers in. So they were just working initially with just a regular die. They'd write the numbers in order. And then they would roll 6 times and try to cross out as many of the numbers as they could. And so they got some number writing. They got some, maybe some subitizing or maybe some counting to figure out how many. Maybe some instant recognition, and then also finding their number on their board. When they got really savvy with that, they could put the numbers in any order. Same thing. So we got them, everybody was writing the numbers in whatever range we wanted them to practice. And sometimes I would say, okay, I'm just going to be really looking for 3s today. So we'd have them really attend to a particular number that we were seeing a lot of backwards numbers. So that, we could do that little bit of formative assessment with them as well. And then then the other thing that's not on here is there are little circles on the bottom of their board so they could check off each time they rolled. Because the other thing that they were paying attention to when they played this game is how many more until I've rolled 6 times. Because if you roll the dice, you're not necessarily going to always roll a different number. So sometimes they would cross out the number. They had some choice here, some agency. Sometimes they would write the number again. Sometimes they'd fill in the box. And then they would check off each time they rolled. So if there were 6 boxes, they rolled 6 times. If there were 9 boxes, they rolled 9 times. If there were 10 boxes, and so on. And so then they were always looking at how many have I rolled? How many more do I need to get to the number of the total number of rolls of this game? It really, for kids that just, one roll and record game was good. They didn't need any more than that. This game, this simple game was so appealing, and it offered them so many different ways to engage with number writing, counting, cardinality, comparing, all the HLCs pretty much in one place. All right. Okay, how are we doing here? All right. Last little bit here was just in terms of how we would keep our counting collections or counting jars fresh. In the beginning of the year, we kept the quantities in the jars within 20 for the most part. And then once everybody more or less demonstrated that they could, that they had one-to-one, not everybody, but for the most part, then we started to add more things to the jars. Then we started changing the size of the jars or the size of the objects that went into the jars. And then we got the kids engaged in helping us fill the jars. Like I said earlier, when it was Halloween time, we filled them with all sorts of random Halloween stuff. I did not know at the time that the lovely para working in my room was deathly afraid of spiders. And I filled all the counting jars, not all of them, but I filled many of them with little spiders. I'm glad she came back, but she was not happy with me. So, you know, maybe just check in. We also switched up the counting jar sheets or the recording sheets. And each time we added a new sheet for their counting jars, the old sheets were available. So first they just used a Post-it and they wrote how many they thought were in the jar on the Post-it. They stuck it on top of the jar. Someone else would come along and count. And did you get the same amount? Did you get a different amount? If you got a different amount, then we'd count again. So first it was just Post-its and we weren't really representing. And we really were in those, at that point, there were probably no more than 8 things in the jars because we wanted to make sure that we weren't out of their range of numbers that they could read and write, even though we were for some of them, but we were there to help them. Then we asked them to begin to start to show how many items were in their jar. So they would draw a picture, and then we had a spot to write a number. And then this spot here was because we had some students that were starting to think about labeling the unit. And so we left that there for them to write, either try to write the word or even just of the first letter or the first sound of the word. Let's see, so that, and then we had some students that just didn't like all those boxes. They felt contained and they knew the routine at this point. And so we had this version of the sheet where they could show how many and then they could write how many on the bottom. So it was not quite so much, I don't know, maybe it was too much, I don't know, the boxes were messing with them. So we gave them this open format. Some children didn't care for that. And then later on in the year, all the other versions were there, even still the Post-it was there. And then we had them starting to think about, okay, how many, if I'm looking at my jar, what's going to be way too low, what's going to be way too high, and what's my just right estimate for how many might be in my jar. And when we did that, we had when we got to that point, we always had 5 of whatever was in the jar. So in that case, the jars all had the same thing. So we had 5 of something because we were asking them to estimate. Usually the teacher would have them in their hand. That's why I'm showing my hand. So that they had something to ground their estimate in, so it wasn't totally random. So that was really, really important that they could see what 5 of, in this case, I think those jars were mostly gems, what 5 gems looked like, so they could make an estimate. And it was really interesting. This we also sort of started in sort of February, March, letting them independently do this. And it was really interesting to see how quickly over the course of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, their estimates, especially their too high, their too low estimate was usually like 1 or 0, -1. But their too high estimates started coming down to a more reasonable range. So that was pretty exciting. And then of course, we would kind of play around with what could go in our jars. Or what our counting collections could be. Like I said, when we did the Halloween, I got some of those witches' fingers with the little random fingernail on it. They came out and they never went away because the kids would use them to pull the items over that they were counting. I actually had to go find more because I think some of them went home in pockets, but that's all right. We would count out, sometimes the counting collection would be popcorn kernels and they would count them out into groups of 10, and then we would count by 10s so we could figure out, what's 100 kernels of popcorn going to look like? And then we'd make the popcorn, and then we'd have to make more because 100 kernels of popcorn isn't actually all that much. And so we would play around with counting things like that. We counted how many seeds were in our pumpkin, and this was early on, so we were counting into groups of 10. We had outdoor counting collections. And then another thing that was driven by them, which was really sweet, is right around Valentine's Day, they decided they wanted all the counting jars to have hearts in them. So I cut out all these paper hearts. And then one day I came over and they were writing on the hearts. And I said, oh, what are you writing? And they said they were writing love. So they wrote love on all the hearts, more or less. And so then from there, they started writing words of kindness. And so, so then they were counting how many words of kindness were on their jars. Okay, I am just about done. I'm sorry I've been talking at you the whole time, but I'm gonna one more just sort of cautionary tale, and then, oh my gosh, I didn't even notice there were things happening in the chat. Oh gosh, good, you all are connecting. Excellent. So the schedule. When I would put up the schedule for a math workshop, this is actually a mistake. The schedule, if it didn't have some sort of temporal component, it really messed with them. So, oops, let me move this over here. So this was something, I think, I don't even remember where that one came from, but the schedule for the part of math that they all really were invested in, which of course is menu, needed to look something like this. They needed to know how much menu time they were going to have, or with the feeling of how much menu time. So we got accustomed to using this sort of structure to give them information about how long things were going to last. And if we didn't stick to that schedule, we heard about it. And because most of the kids sort of, they loved the warm up, they pretty much loved our number sense routines. They kind of sustained through whole group or small group work, which was sort of the more concept development time. And then they just hung in there until menu. I'd have kids come in the morning and say, is it a menu day? Of course, every day was a menu day, but they just had to check and make sure. And so I had to be really mindful of giving them the information that they needed to feel safe and feel comfortable, and to know, how much menu they were going to have on a given day. Sometimes our math time, depending upon our schedule, happened in one continuous block of time. And other times it was 2 blocks. So we'd have a morning workshop and an afternoon. And I had to share this with them at the beginning of the day, so that or the beginning of math time, so that if we didn't have menu during our math time, that they knew that menu was going to happen at another time of the day. And that never went away for this particular group, which is why this was, when the first time I put this up, they were like, what is happening? Because menu looked really small down there at the bottom, even though it was there. And a lot of them at this point knew the word menu, or they knew that the word with the M meant menu. That was not enough information for them. So I really had to be super duper explicit with this group about the time frame, or at least the temporal component of menu for them. All right, everybody, I'm just going to come out of the share here for a minute. Thank you so much for listening. I hope, listening to this journey that we went on trying to launch menu, I hope that there's something in here that you take away from. And I just wonder, are there any questions or any wonderings, or is there anything that I said that I talked too fast, or that you have a question about? Please either put it in the chat or just chime in.
Lily, I have a question.
Yeah.
How long was menu?
Oh, right. Good question. So our math time was different every day. So if our whole group time, or like whole group, small groups, was 20 minutes, the menu was 20 minutes. Yeah, and so menu was always roughly the same amount of time as our whole group or our concept development time. And that's something that I learned in the menu class. before the menu class, menu sometimes was maybe 15, 20 minutes, and it was never enough time. And it didn't really feel like it honored the learner's opportunity to make those choices, have agency, and engage with the task. So in the beginning of the year, menu time, including concept development time, was about 10 minutes, maybe 5 in September. They were just, and then we built up over time. And I would say the longest menu that we had was 25 minutes, around the 25-minute mark. We just, start to get, some of us are done, some of us are still engaged. And I did have a few things for kids to do when there really wasn't enough time to make a new menu choice, but we still had maybe 5 minutes. So like the game Going to Boston, where they would roll 3 dice, take out the greatest number, roll the remaining 2 dice, take out the greatest number, and then roll the last dice and then count how many. So they had some things like that, which we called, just quick choices, because for us, 25 minutes, sometimes in the afternoon we could go for a half an hour, but this particular group, 20 minutes was good. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Did you say that you, in order to encourage that, like sticking with something, you would say, like if it was one of the menus where it was a do this, then do that.
Yep.
They were doing 2 things, but it wasn't like free choice. You can do like 5 different activities during this 20 minutes. It was really like maybe 1 or 2.
Yeah. And we didn't do this until we got up to that 20 minutes of menu, because we wanted to make sure that when we had to do this first and then make a choice, that there was genuinely time to make a choice. And sometimes I would say to a student, especially a student that had was doing something that was taking a really long time, I started setting a timer. And I'd say, we're gonna work for the first 5 minutes. If you finish before that and you've checked in with a grown-up, you can make another menu choice. If the timer buzzes at 5, you can keep going, or you can make a menu choice. Just again, to reassure them that they weren't gonna be, stuck in number writing purgatory, because for some of them it was really, really hard. The fine motor. This is the first group of kindergartners I had where only one child could write their name when they came to school on the first day of school. I had never seen anything like this before, so we had to sort of give them that information of like, hey, we know you're working hard, but we're going to call it, at this particular time. All right, everybody.
I'm sorry, Lily, when you were going to do window pane, that happened outside of menu time, correct?
Yep, it did.
Just like the ALN thing. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So, and that was just in the beginning. And even when we had the first do this, then do this, like I said, it was not until we were up to a good chunk of menu time. But yeah, the window pane sometimes would happen. Sometimes it would happen, but like it was your ticket to menu kind of thing. And sometimes it would happen at the end of menu. I will say the one piece of the ALN lesson structure that I'm really horrible at is the closure. We often do the closure the next day. And for us, that the reason was that, well, also I'm just really terrible about the clock. I'm constantly have timers going off. But we bumped right up against lunchtime, and there was no way I was gonna sustain. It's also our classroom was in the gym, which was where the cafeteria was. So yeah, so I would do that at the beginning of the day. So sometimes we'd start even with we'd start with the window pane, and we would just do one pane. Yeah. All right, Emily just asked a question. Emily, have you had success with partner games? Yes, yes. I mean, we had to teach them how to be a partner. We had to practice it so much in our whole group time. I would say with this group, which felt late to me, this group didn't really successfully engage in partner play until December. And we practiced it everywhere, and in all areas of learning, morning meeting. And so oftentimes what we would do is during our whole group time is we would learn a game, but we were also really practicing playing that game. And this was also a group that really struggled with losing or winning gracefully, either or. And so many of our games were just finishing games or collaborative play games. They couldn't really handle so much. They struggled with it. So, but in previous years, I bet in previous years, I would say around mid-October, we had a routine down. We practiced saying good game, and sometimes we'd say, oh well, and we'd practice saying that, even though we didn't really feel that way. And we would say it's okay to feel that way. It's just not okay to like freak out on your partner. So yes. And then this group, they actually asked me to set up Zoom sessions so they could play math games with each other when we were home during 2020. So we got there, but it took some time, and it took a lot of modeling. Yeah.
Lily, I have a quick question. When you were introducing new activities for menu, did you do that teaching during your main lesson time? And how did you balance that with your curriculum or other lesson plans?
Okay, yes. Anything that they played in menu was they had played it at least 5 to 10 times in a whole group or in a small group. Oftentimes it was in a small group setting. And like I said, we played it's the same game. We just changed it up throughout the year, and that helped them too with their stability within menu. And then at this time we were using Engage New York, and to say that I went rogue is true. And I followed the sequence of the curriculum, but I could not in good conscience with this group give them problem sets and give them things that just were going to infuriate them. So we turned all the content from Engage New York into games if it wasn't already a game, and taught it that way, or into warm-ups. A lot of our warm-ups as they were coming in were specific to the fluency component. Here's an organizational tip. Okay, yeah, so anything that they got to in menu, they were pretty well versed at, and if they weren't, it was a really good reflection on my part. We were not ready. And we had a few bumpy rides there, or I'd like the first time we played all in a row, we played it like 2 weeks straight with just the same cards even. And then I said, okay, all in a row is going to be a choice today. They couldn't find the cards, they couldn't set up the cards, and I was like, okay, well, obviously I need to rewind and figure out what went wrong in the instruction there. And we got it under control. But yeah, anytime there was a breakdown in the system or the behavior, it was often my fault. Occasionally stuff followed us in from recess, but usually it was because I had not been as organized or sequential as I should have been. So
yay, kindergartners.
Yay, kindergartners. Well, I mean, I always had anything I asked them to work with was visual. So the menu was visual, and like for you guys, it was mostly words, but for them, it always incorporated an image of what we were doing, a picture. But did you want to say more about what you were organizational tips?
I just mean like how you set it all up in terms of kids accessing the menu, and like, what if they're all trying to go play Shut the Box and you don't have enough? So I'm a big fan of clothespins and of the clothespins and like little dots, so that way they can see how many kids can be at that station. But I'm just curious about any tips around that.
Yes. Okay. So we were really fortunate that we had enough materials, but for things when we didn't have enough materials, yes, we would have dots. And sometimes on the menu, I don't have a picture of that, but I would actually put 6 dots on the virtual menu, and they'd put their name right on the dot. We also had everything provisioned for them. So really the things that they needed to get were, you know, if they needed it was a pencil, they knew where to find that. And otherwise everything was like, it was at the table for them. Or I had a shelf in my room that had, it had, you know, all the different versions of the counting jar sheets, different versions of roll and record, and the dice that go with it. So that was another thing that we had to teach them, was the independence of accessing those materials. But because it was all laid out and organized, they were fairly independent with it. You know, every now and then we'd have to say, whoa, what happened at roll and record? We gotta do a little organizing, but it was a good conversation about sorting and classifying our dice. And we talk about how it was really important that things, you know, have a place and they go back to that place so people can find them. And then I'm also a really big fan of like things in bags, so that like everything, like if there's a game that has multiple components, everything just goes back in the bag. And I put those dot stickers, like you said, Emily, on the bag so that they knew that this was a 2-person game or it was a 4-person game. And I had a lot of also my sister-in-law got, or they got married, and they ordered like those little organza bags, and they thought they were ordering 100, but they ordered 100 bags of 100. So I have a lot of those left over. Those are great too. And then you know, just making sure that everything was already provisioned for them. They didn't have to count anything out. They didn't have to really, all they could, it was all very grab and go. Later on in the year, when we lost our classroom, I was lucky to inherit a bunch of sort of paper, like 8.5 by 11 size baskets. And then I could put all, because at that point we were playing more games with multiple pieces of things. I could put everything in that basket and stack up the baskets. And so then the kids would just, you know, the pair would just grab a basket, take it to wherever they were going to work, and then they could just come back and put stack the baskets back up. It helps keep things really easy at cleanup time as well. But, you know, sometimes they'd fall off the shelf and we'd have to organize them again. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming. I hope you found something helpful, and good luck with whatever it is that you're working on.